All right, hey guys, let's kick off this project Big Seven. And, I think it's always a good idea when you're kicking something off. Let's learn a little bit about the history. And I'll share some of my personal history with the 7mm Remington mag. You'll hear me call it the Big Seven a lot. It's just kind of a fun nickname I have for it. But let's review some of the history. Let's compare it to some things. Let's talk about what kind of made it take off back in the 60s. And yeah, it'll just be a good way to kick this off. So I've typed up a sheet here with some data. I've got out some of my old reloading books that were printed in the 60s. And let's just dive right in. Okay, so right there I've listed some of the most popular cartridges in history from both Winchester and Remington, and the date that they were announced officially. And it's a little bit interesting to note the timing of the 7 mag and the 300 Win mag. In the late 50s, Winchester came out with the 264 and the 338, and neither one of them really gained a whole lot of traction at that time. And honestly, compared to the 300 Win mag and 7 mag, they don't even come close in popularity. Remington had the 280 Remington at that same time. And then in the early 60s, 1962, Remington came out with the 7 mag, and it took off like wildfire. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. And then right on the heels of that, Winchester came out with the 300 Win mag in 1963. And that was to compete with the 7 mag and to kind of introduce something a little bit different, 30 caliber versus 284. It is interesting to note a couple, the 280 Remington, basically, although it's a great cartridge, its popularity essentially dropped off once the Big 7 was introduced about 5 years later. And Remington dinked around with different names for the 280 Remington. They had the 7mm Express, 7mm Mod 6. They played with that for several years to try to get it to take off, but it never really did. Not that it's not a great cartridge. And then sadly, the original 6.5 PRC, I say that laughingly, but the 6.5 Remington mag introduced in 1966 never took off. Terrible marketing, terrible selection of bullets at the time, but it was way ahead of its time, and unfortunately now it's basically a dead cartridge. But let's just keep talking here about the 7 mag. So when it came out, what I saw happening, now I wasn't around in the early 60s, but in the 70s and 80s, the people that I knew that dove into the 7 mag, they had grown up on the 270, 308, 30-06, and the marketing that Remington put behind the 7 mag was really good, and people just jumped to it and said, man, I need a little more powerful cartridge. I know people, I hunted with people in the late 70s and early 80s that did that. They grew up on a Knot 6 and said, hey, oh wow, look at this. And it had been marketed so well, and it was a great cartridge. And so a lot of that was going on for that period of time, for about 30 years there. One thing that's funny is the early reputation of the 7 mag was that it ruined meat. And I laughed at that when I heard that the first time, even when I was very young. I was like, it's not, the cartridge itself can't ruin meat. Okay, it's shot placement or it's the bullet that's ruining the meat. And that's really what it was, right? It came out at a time when there wasn't great bullet selection for the types of velocities the 7 mag was capable of. I mean, look at this, right? The 140 grain retained velocity at 100 yards is still over 3,000 feet per second. And at 200, we're at 2,900 feet per second. So the old cup and core bullets back in that day, they just weren't going to handle that. And I'm sure on game, they just exploded at those ranges when they hit. Poor penetration, lots of meat, probably, good kills, but a lot of damage along the way. And most of the hunters at that time were chasing velocity. This was the big new high velocity cartridge, so they were using lighter bullets. In fact, I think like Hornady didn't even offer 175, or maybe it was Spear, didn't even offer 175 grain bullets for a long time. It was all just lighter stuff, 140s, 150s, some 160s. But here's something interesting, okay? Let's compare the 7 mag to the 30-06. And I'm just gonna jump out here so you can hopefully see this whole table at once. The top table is the 7 mag with a 175 grain bullet, 2900 at the muzzle. The bottom table is the 30-06 with a 180 grain bullet, 2800 at the muzzle. So we can debate all day about those muzzle velocities, guys, but even if you can squeeze another 50 feet per second out of one or the other or both, it's all relative, right? This comparison is really good comparison of these two cartridges with the higher end of the bullet weights that they're designed for. You can pause your screen and study this if you want, but what you're going to see here is not a very big difference in performance between the 7 mag and the 30-06, okay? The reality is there's just not that big of a difference. The 7 mag bullets have a little bit better BC, not huge, not a huge difference, especially in the heavier weight bullets. Again, and I'm kind of speaking more of the past. Today's bullets are different. This is all still pretty much true for today, but in the past, there wasn't a big difference in BC. And you can just see here, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two. So was the 7 mag much more powerful than the 06? It was, but not by a lot. 7% on energy, 6% on velocity, 9% on trajectory. So maybe at best, you would say that it's, 7 to 10% more powerful than the 30-06, but Remington marketed the 7mm masterfully, and the rest is history, right? It's still to this day, it's a hugely popular cartridge. Sadly, they didn't have the same marketing plan for the 6.5 Remington mag, and they even screwed it up for the RUM and the SOM series, which if those had been properly marketed, they should still be dominant today, but that is a chat for another day. So let's look at a couple things in these reloading books. This is a Hornady manual from 1967. So 5 years after the cartridge was introduced. And you'll see that, for the 175, they were achieving 2,900. Great sectional density on that. The BC was nothing to write home about. So at the same time, the 30-06, which had been out for a long time at this point, with 180s, it was achieving 2,800. Sectional density, not as good as 7 mag, or 284 diameter. And the BC obviously is not terrible, but compared to what people are doing today, not great. This is a Spear manual from 1963 or 64. So really about the same time the 7 mag was introduced. You can see here, they didn't even have 175 grain bullets, but note the velocities they were claiming with 160s. They were getting as high as 3146 here. So see, that had people fired up at the time, right? If I can drive a 160 grain bullet, 3150, that was something that was all new for Western big game hunting type cartridges. And the 30-06, it was, of course, had a big following by then. And you can see that here with the 180s, they weren't even getting to 2,800 back then with the powders they had. They were in the low 27s. So it was a big difference at the time. At the time, the 7 mag came out with the powders and the data available. It was performing at a higher level than the 30-06, like just another tier of cartridge. But in reality, if you hand load, the difference, is maybe 10%. And really, I'm not here to compare 7 mag to 30-06, but just being realistic about what it is and what it isn't. I think that the balance of sectional density, ballistic coefficient, and velocities that are achievable with the 7 mag makes it a really good choice for Western big game hunting. And that's what puts it a tier above the 30-06, obviously the 270 and the 308. And we're going to talk some other time about, really there's 3 categories of cartridges: first tier, second tier, third tier, and I base that off how much energy they can generate at the muzzle. But we'll cover that another time. So hopefully this is interesting kickoff on 7 mag. We will have fun with it. I still don't know exactly how I'm going to approach it. I have a ton of factory ammo, and I may start with some factory ammo just to see what that new Tika likes. And maybe once we dial that down a little bit, we will work up some hand loads. I think one thing we're going to be cognizant of, right, is bullet selection based on the velocities. You know, if we're going to be chasing the lighter bullets, the 140s, we're not going to do it with cup and core, right? We're going to do that with a bullet that will hold together at high impact velocities. If we're running the 175s, we probably are okay with cup and core because those velocities are down at impact. We'll cover all that, guys. Looking forward to it.